Let's talk a little bit about our dim-witted cousin, the Neanderthal. Actually, I'm totally wrong on that point. Neanderthals are not dim-witted. They had very large brains. In addition to having a large brain, we see archaeologically evidence of a very rich culture. They're a type of Homo sapiens, and they're named after a region and a valley where they were first discovered in Germany. So this is where we get the Neanderthal or Neander's Valley. The Neanderthal, the nomenclature here, we don't drop the H. Sometimes you see it Tal. That's not accurate. So we say the Neanderthal. H is silent, but we continue to use it in science. Either way, let's take a look at this Neanderthal. And I think it's fascinating from a health perspective because the Neanderthal provides us with the very first evidence of healthcare among our hominin ancestors. Let's move to the next slide. While Neanderthals descended from African species of hominins, Homo heidelbergensis, they are not an African species. They emerge or evolve in areas of Europe, we can see here on our map, in addition to areas of the Middle East. These are the known Neanderthal sites. I don't need you to recall all of this information. I do need you to remember that they are a European and Middle Eastern species, and we do find some evidence of them moving up into regions of Siberia as well. Let's move to the next slide. The Neanderthal is a type of cold-adapted Homo sapiens. In fact, the proper terminology for this cold-adapted Homo sapiens is Homo sapiens neanderthaliensis. I know it's a big, ugly word or collection of words. I apologize on behalf of anthropology. Either way, the Neanderthal lived between 125,000 and 30,000 BCE. Calibrating that, we could say 127,000 years ago, and roughly, well, I'm still going to say about 30,000 years ago, in and abouts there. They eventually become extinct. When we look at the archaeological evidence of Neanderthals, we do gain some insight into the types of conditions that affected them. Now remember, as pointed out in our textbook, Neanderthals are nomadic. They're living through mountainous regions in Europe and in the Middle East. So we have to expect that there's going to be occupational injuries. We're going to see that type of evidence in their remains. That's what we see. Trauma, arthritis, malformed limbs, and paralysis from time to time as a result of trauma. In fact, arthritis, this should be no surprise as well. This is the oldest documented type of disease that we see in the archaeological and fossil record. Dinosaurs, arthritic. Prehistoric bears, arthritic. Neanderthals, arthritic as well. Interestingly, we don't see, even though we're getting closer to modern times, we don't see any evidence of these major infections. We still don't see tuberculosis. We don't see leprosy. We don't see syphilis nor malaria. Now, malaria makes sense. We are in Europe, the Middle East, during an ice age 125,000 years ago. And while we do currently have mosquitoes through the Mediterranean region, you need to imagine in a much cooler environment. That environment during the Pleistocene is not going to support mosquito populations. Malaria is not going to be present. So that's one of those explained. As for leprosy and syphilis, I'm going to tell you now, syphilis doesn't emerge until Columbus discovers the New World. We'll get to that, 1492, and what begins to take place during the 1500s. As for leprosy, while this appears to be discussed in the Old Testament, in fact, it's not that old. The Middle East had no experience with leprosy until somewhere around the conquests of Alexander the Great. We'll talk a little bit more about that once we get to the ancient Greeks and Hellenism. Let's move to the next slide. Let's use the Neanderthals as a case study, and let's go to the Shandy Dark Caves, which provides us with a good example of health issues, but also the first evidence for health care or perhaps nursing. Let's move to the next slide. The evidence that I want to refer to comes from an area in modern day Iraq called Chandidar Caves. And this is a region that was occupied by Neanderthals between about 60 and 80,000 years before the present in the Zagros Mountains. Now, if you're looking at the bottom right corner, you see an example of the Zagros Mountains. You see a little bit about the type of terrain that these people lived in. And don't worry, they did not build that bridge. I said they were complex, but they're not that complex. Let's move to the next slide. Now, at the Shandidar Caves, there's a number of individuals who have been buried. Now, this is important from an archaeological perspective because this is the first evidence for burials among any Homo sapiens species that we have, at least clear burials, indisputable. I want to take a look at Shandidar 1, or often what's referred to as Nandi, affectionately, kind of the nickname. And what we know is this individual, they suffered severe head trauma at a very young age. And as a result of that trauma, it caused paralysis. So we can see the fracture in the remains, and we know that it's very old. And in addition, we can see the ways that the humeri, for example, here we're looking at, the left humeri is fully developed. That's on the right-hand side of your screen. And the right humeri is not fully developed. This humerus, we can see the distal or the lower end is not fully formed. It's not as thick. What this illustrates is the individual, as a result of that trauma, they suffered paralysis on the right side of the body. Now think back to that picture I just showed you. I said Neanderthals were nomadic. They were living in a very difficult terrain. They were hunters. They hunted big game. They lived in a cold environment. What do you think the odds are of somebody at a very young age suffering severe trauma to their head, and not only a severe trauma, and I would imagine there would be some sort of concussion associated with that, but also paralysis on the right side of the body? If you want to put that into perspective, think that you've, for example, gone into Algonquin, the back country. You're, say, a week in on a canoe or a hiking trip, and you're with a smaller partner, or maybe even a couple partners, and you fall and you become paralyzed. What's the likelihood of somebody getting you out of there or being able to take care of you? That's going to be really difficult, even with the best technologies that we have today. Now imagine 80,000 years ago, for example, what type of technology exists. We would imagine that this individual would not live long, that life expectancy for an individual that suffered head trauma is going to be low, but that's not the case. When we look at the individual, one of the things that archaeologists do is engage in a type of forensic anthropology. We've briefly referred to forensic anthropology, but I'll just review it here. A few ideas with respect to forensic anthropology. We're interested in identifying the sex of the individual, for example, how old they are, any diseases that they have, those types of questions. And we do so by examining the skeletal remains. So archaeologists, in particular bioarchaeologists, they're also going to look at a skeleton from that type of perspective. And they're able to age the skeleton. And what we know is Nandi did not die at a young age. They died at what would be defined as Neanderthal old age, probably in their 40s. So to get that far in life, paralysis, one side of your body, you don't live in a cave forever. They don't have villages. They're constantly moving. Nursing was required. And this isn't the only individual that we see that type of evidence in. So what we're seeing here is the emergence of nursing associated with Neanderthal populations. We have a type of paleo medicine here that's evident in the fossil or the skeletal record. Let's move to the next slide. The Shanidar caves are important because they provide us with the first evidence for ritualistic burials. And I just want to go through a few of the burials here to give you some insight into what we've learned about Neanderthals from this archaeological site. Shanidar 1 suffered paralysis, was in lifelong pain, death at age 45. And as pointed out, for Shanidar to get to this age would have needed some care. Shanidar 2 clearly has arthritis, the cause of death, falling rocks. Age of death, around 30 years of age. This gives us some idea of the type of environment that they lived within. Shanidar 3, stab wound, that's the cause of death. Interestingly, Shanidar 3 lived approximately 30 weeks, 30,000 years. No. The Shanidar caves then are important because it provides us with insight into the life and the experience of Homo sapiens neanderthaliensis. And here at the Shanidar cave, we find evidence of burials. I want to run through these just to give you a little bit more insight into their environment and what perhaps was going on. Shanidar 1, we've talked about. This is Nandi. Paralysis, lifelong pain, death age 45. And we said care would have been required to get to that age in life, 45 years with that type of paralysis. Shanidar 2 provides us with evidence of arthritis. That didn't cause the individual's death. The cause of death, falling rocks, age 30. So some insight into some of the common problems that people experienced at this point of time. We do see a lot of trauma. Shanidar 3, I think, is particularly interesting because it provides us with the earliest evidence of interpersonal conflict. Death, age 50, of a stab or projectile wound. Interestingly, this individual lived for 3 weeks after the stabbing and appears to have died, apparently, of complications. Care seems to be part of that narrative. Who did the caring? Shanidar 4 perhaps provides us with some evidence into that or insight into that. Shanidar 4, referred to as the flower burial, alongside of this individual, this ritualistic type of burial, we find flowers and plants with known medicinal properties. Now, this could be merely coincidental, some people argue, but I think arguably, as some archaeologists have pointed out, perhaps they were honoring this individual as a healer, and some of the flowers and medicines that they collected during their lifetime, they would have needed for the afterlife. And that is a common theme among Neanderthals. It's not just that they were burying their dead, they were including grave goods. They had developed some idea of something beyond an afterworld, so to speak, after this life. Let's leave it there. Take care. Make sure that you take a look at your readings, the material that's been posted online, and I'll talk to you soon. Take care. Okay, so here we can wrap up with a few points about the so-called Golden Age and perhaps tie together some of the material from the first part of this lecture on hominin evolution and disease during the Pliocene and the Pleistocene and ask about the Golden Age. In our textbook, it does pose the question, was there ever an age that humans were free from disease? And as Ackernet pointed out in 1981, he said, in spite of this legend of a golden, happy, diseaseless age, the so-called Golden Age, we've never been free from disease. Now, the thing we need to keep in consideration or in mind here is how much disease. Right? So how much disease was around? And the word that we would use would be the morbidity. So how much morbidity or what's the incidence of disease during this period of time? So we've pointed out that malaria, that would have been around, definitely. We've pointed out that schistosomiasis, that's been around, and a few other diseases really related to the environment. So we've never been free from disease. How much? Not a whole lot. Some of the things that we've taken into consideration is population size. So if, for example, we have a couple of individuals or a couple of groups living close together, and I'll draw up top here a couple of other groups living much further away, and let's say on average, these individuals in this first section over here, for argument's sake, let's say that they're living about 1 kilometer apart, each of those individuals, right? 1 kilometer apart. If we go to the second group over here and we say how much space is that, let's go ahead and say 100 kilometers. And let's say group 2 to group 3 is approximately, well, let's say another half of that 150 kilometers away. Now, if we have an outbreak of disease within this first group here, okay, over here we have an outbreak of disease in group number 1. What we're going to see is that they are able to spread that disease quite rapidly because they're in such close proximity. So they're able to walk and infect other species of their kind or similar species. In contrast, where you have 100 kilometers of distance, the question becomes, if somebody's suffering from diarrhea, a lot of fever, are they going to reach the second group? In all likelihood, let's imagine they could walk with butt cheeks clenched, maybe vomiting, high fevers, rash. Let's say they get so far 25 kilometers, which would really be quite a distance. They're going to die out, and they're never going to reach the second group. And with that group of individuals dying out, that have a severe, say, virus or bacterial infection, they're not going to be able to infect group 2. So it's just not going to happen. We're going to get absolutely no infection of group 2. The virus dies out. And as pointed out again, I'm going to come back to it, that's one of the reasons why we want to ensure that people continue to physically distance and use some sort of prophylactic on their face, a nice tight-fitting mask that's going to reduce those opportunities for viruses to affect other individuals. As for getting to group 3, 150 kilometers, it's not going to happen. So this really, at this point of time, we can say how much disease? Not a lot. We're not seeing much disease because the populations have just not increased enough. And one of the things I'm going to tell you about right now, and we're going to come back to it later on, but measles. Measles is highly infectious. It has an R naught factor of approximately 18. The thing about measles is, for it to become endemic, you need approximately 400,000 individuals, like I said, for it to become endemic or regularly circulating within a population. In other cases where there were certainly outbreaks of infectious disease and viral spillover, that happened in the past and would have wiped out smaller groups. There's no question about that. So let's go ahead and say they got sick. First group here, they spread it to somebody else, and they begin to wipe themselves out. And one lone person tried to get somewhere. They died as well, and we're left with the remaining 2 groups. So despite the fact that there was some disease, the burden was low, and eventually what we start to see, especially with the Neanderthals, is that some sort of health care begins to emerge to address some of the common issues. So, for example, we had talked about trauma. perhaps stomach issues, you know, anything that relates to indigestion, we, perhaps pain. Hallucinogenics, they've been used by people for time immemorial. Even the ability, perhaps, to staunch blood flow through the use of starches. So if somebody cuts themselves, right, they're able to use some starchy substance. We see orangutans do that today. So in the past, yeah, people did have various methods, and we talked a little bit about some of the pharmacopoeia, or the pharmaceuticals, the drugs, the herbs that we do find, arguably in the case of, for example, the shaman burial with the Neanderthals. But we do see evidence that allows us to make those arguments. Okay, let's leave it there, and we'll pick up with the next lecture before too long. See you soon.